Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another thing where I talk about things. Today, I need to get a haircut. My hair's getting quite long and quite curly, and it gets out of control. I spent forever just trying to get it to not look silly. But aside from that, I would like to talk about the female leaders in Civ 5. Reason being, because there's some interesting politics behind them. There's three that are particularly of note that are in the game for no reason, for convoluted political reasons, and for some interesting reasons. And so I want to actually go over those. But Civ 5 has actually always been kind of a fun series because it works on being vaguely historical, but not completely. What they do is they always set up these caricatures of political characters. And this is sensible because there's not really any way that you could cram a ton of history into a game like that. But also because in reality, we don't really know a whole lot about a lot of these political people. There's all kinds of different historical writings on things, but most of them are lies, or people trying to sway everyone's opinion. In fact, Theodora, who I'd like to talk about, has a rather fascinating story where one of her detractors insists that she and her husband were actually demons, and that at night, their heads came up off of their bodies and then floated around the castle. And he says this is true, he saw it happen. So you get all kinds of things where people tell lies, or you can tell that something was clearly made up after the fact, but because it was so long ago, it just becomes history, you know. And there's also another issue where a lot of old people, like if you look at the name Darius, for example, there were a lot of people named Darius. And many of them were important. They might have ruled large empires, they might have ruled small empires, but like, there was a really important Darius that we care about, and then there were all these little Dariuses that went on to go do other things. So when you find history, like when you find a written text about a guy named Darius, it can be really tough to tell whether or not you're reading about the right Darius or not. This is a big deal in history. So a lot of what we know about various rulers, for example, Julius Caesar, comes from things like plays, popular culture. So Julius Caesar, we all know about Julius Caesar. We know about the Ides of March and the fact that he got stabbed in the back. But that's all a work of fiction. Julius Caesar wrote that, and he may not have been stabbed on the Ides of March. Maybe people didn't really betray him. But the politics were mayhem. And the similar story is true for these female civs that I want to talk about. Like I say, I might talk about other stuff, but it'll depend on how much time we have at the end of this. But anyway, though, I have a little story that's kind of related to this. Is a while ago I was playing Civ 4 with Kenza, and she was playing as Queen Victoria. And you get great people in this game. Like every now and then a great person spawns, and they have a name. They're someone from history. And there are female great people, and she got like Mary Curry or something like that. But the thing is that all the models are male. They just have one model for every type of great person. And so she got Mary Curry, and it was like a dude in a lab coat. And she goes, how come it's a dude? And I was like, well, because they've only got one model for the great people. And she goes, oh, that's so typical of the gaming industry. She says, as she's playing as Queen Victoria, and as Boudica of the Celts is storming through her lands and taking over her country, I'm over here with Isabella as my vassal, and my chief trading partner is Catherine the Great of Russia. You get a little bit of a confirmation bias when you talk about these sort of things. But Civ 5 apparently felt that it could represent women a little bit better, and so when they released Civ 5, they have a bit of this bizarre, almost sort of affirmative action thing going on, where they added female characters, and they included the ones that made sense. Like they have Elizabeth and Catherine the Great and so on and so forth. I don't know if they have Elizabeth. They have Queen Victoria, I think. No, whatever the case, they have the ones that made sense, who ruled over vast empires during periods of great importance. With a great deal of history and a lot of writing about them because they ruled over a time when all the local people, there was a lot more people who could read and write. They have those are the ones that make sense. Like you associate Queen Victoria, Queen Victoria has a whole era. People know about the Victorian era. We all know about Queen Victoria. Catherine the Great. We all know Catherine the Great. But Civ 5 introduced some women who I'd never heard of before, and when I play games like this, I oftentimes, if I get to know a character or I'm curious about a character, I'll go look them up. And this is actually why I really like Dynasty Warriors 3, because I got used to seeing Lord Cao Cao everywhere, and the voice acting used to just crack me up, and I'm like, man, whose history are they really butchering? And so I went and I looked up a lot of these historical characters. Lord Cao Cao. I went to find out who won the war, what happened. It's actually kind of terrible. If you play Dynasty Warriors 3, the forces of Wei actually won, and they established the Jin dynasty. And from the Jin dynasty is where we actually get the phrase "let them eat cake." Yeah, so Cao Cao winning that war probably didn't turn out for the best, but yeah, it was, as the case was, one of his advisors came to the Emperor of Jin, and they said, "Emperor, our people can't afford to eat rice." And he goes, "Well, why don't they eat their beef?" The emperor says, "Just let them eat their beef. If they don't have any rice, let them eat their beef." And that's where you get the same thing, Marie Antoinette. Well, if they can't afford bread, why don't they just eat their cake? Or as we say in modern times, well, if they can't afford, college, why don't they just ride around why don't they just sell their Cadillacs? It's the same. History goes in cycles, and so it's kind of like there's probably at any given historical any historical period, you can find people who have that sort of let them eat cake mentality, and who get up there and they express it, and they don't even realize that basically they're just saying let them eat cake. So yes, but the Jin dynasty is where that phrase kind of originates from. Let them eat beef. So, yeah, I looked up all this stuff when I played Dynasty Warriors, and I got, the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, very fascinating. I like these characters. I have a book on the art of war that has commentary from Cao Cao. Cao Cao. His actual name is like Cao Cao, or something like that. I can't pronounce the Chinese names. I don't know the phonemes. So just bear with me. I pronounce them Dynasty Warriors 3 style, which is terrible. Don't ever repeat. If you ever care, don't repeat what I say because it's wrong. But anyway though. So Civ 4 is the same way. Sometimes I run into Civs that I think are really interesting. Like, for example, Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa was a really powerful Civ, especially if you play with unrestricted leaders and you know what you're doing. And so I would go and I looked up Mansa Musa, and I found out a bunch of interesting history about Mansa Musa. And Civ 5, same thing, but in this case, I looked them up not because I was really kind of interested in the caricature, but because I'd never heard of these people, or I'd heard of them actually well before I played Civ 5. Wu Zetian I'd read about well before I even got Civ 5, and Wu Zetian is interesting for her own reasons. But I'll start with the one that doesn't make any sense, and that was actually the most disappointing, and that is Dido of Carthage. In Civ 5, they replaced Hannibal with a woman leader named Dido. And I thought to myself, like, oh, okay, so Dido must have done something really interesting. Because if you ask somebody, like, who is name one person from Carthage, name an influential figure from Carthage, all anyone is ever going to tell you is Hannibal. That's all anybody knows. Nobody knows anybody else but Hannibal. Like, Hannibal's all you got. And actually, it used to crack me up because Scipio was the Roman general that eventually defeated Carthage and Hannibal. And so in that game, you can get a great general, and it might be Scipio. There's just a random chance. So it kind of amuses me when you're playing as Carthage, and then, like, you get, great general, it's Scipio. It's like, nothing can stop us now. We've got Scipio on our side this time. Yeah. So anyway, though, all anyone knows is Hannibal. And for whatever reason, the creators of Civ 5 decided that, no, Carthage needs to be run by a woman. So they introduced this character named Dido. So I went to go look her up to figure out what she's doing. Because in my opinion, it's not bad to have female characters at all, because a lot of them have really, really fascinating past. Like, if you look into how they got into power, it's oftentimes very colorful, and it's just fascinating. Like, there's so many winding twists and turns, and they come from such like, they bounce all over the world, a lot of them do. I mean, like, Lola Montez is seen as a really bad influence, but she was a political figure who just bounced all over Europe. She went here and there, and then got married to the King of Bavaria, and then got up and went to the US, and, just like that. She just did so much stuff. So even if you think of, like, these characters as not being very potent politicians, to get to where they were, to be notable at all, they're still really fascinating. But Dido was extremely disappointing, because I looked it up and it turned out that Dido's not even a real person, or probably isn't a real person. What she is, she's like Romulus and Remus. Like Romulus and Remus, as the story goes, they're the founders of Rome, and they were raised by wolves and da-da-da-da-da. Not real people. Like, if you were trying to set up a game based on historical characters or even caricatures, you wouldn't put Romulus and Remus in the game because they're mythical. But they put Dido in this game, and arguably she's a founder story. The way that the story goes is that Dido came to the place where Carthage would be founded, and she asked the people who owned the land there, she said, hey, can I have a little bit of land? And they said, how much land? And she goes, oh, just as much land as I can stretch an ox hide around. And they said, okay, that sounds fair. So what she did is she cut this ox hide into thin ribbons, and then she stretched the ox hide out, and she actually made a circle around a hill, around a rather large hill. And in so doing, she laid the foundations for Carthage. And then it said that she later went on, she promised to marry some guy after her husband died, and this was kind of a political ploy. So when her husband died, what she did is she walked up and she threw herself into the funeral pyre and she burned to death, and that's the story of Dido. It sounds rather fictional. I mean, the odds of somebody actually walking into a fire to kill themselves is pretty unlikely. What was much more common among leaders at that time period was poison. You'd have to be insane to burn yourself to death. That is a slow and terrible death. So anyway, though, so probably not a real character, and that was about all I could find out about her, was just that she wasn't real, and that she'd replaced Hannibal. And yet, despite replacing Hannibal, the game continues to make all of the Carthage-specific advantages and, like, unit tricks and everything like that, they're all related to Hannibal. You know, like, they get to climb mountains, for example, and that's a Hannibal thing. I mean, Hannibal led an army with elephants in it over the mountains and into Rome. It's a Hannibal thing. So yeah, so basically, she's Hannibal, but she's the fictional character who founded, you know, Carthage. So really lame in my opinion. But that's the only one who's actually really lame. The second one is interesting from a political standpoint. In terms of what she does while she's in power, there's really not a lot I can say. But how she got into power is much more fascinating. And very difficult to tell what's true and what isn't. But Wu Zetian, and as I say, I don't know how to pronounce the name, so just Wu Zetian. Wu Zetian, this is my American accent. But Wu Zetian actually she would be normally a very obscure Chinese leader. There are a lot of people who would be more influential and that a lot of people in the West would associate with China much more closely if they knew anything about China at all. But Wu Zetian is important in China, not because of anything that she specifically did, but because of Mao Zedong's wife, believe it or not. What this actually was is that during the Opium Wars and during the general collapse of China, when the Western powers started to really mess with them, the Empress Dowager Cixi was in charge. She was running the country, and a lot of people regarded her as one of the worst empresses, one of the worst leaders, period, that China had ever seen. She was kind of passive-aggressive. She was resistant to a lot of things. The politics surrounding her are so bad, it's really difficult to say what's right and wrong. But I had a history book on the Opium Wars, and just, man, the Chinese people just dump on this woman. Like, she was regarded as basically the collapse of Chinese civilization as they know it. And a lot of people blamed her gender. And they're very hard on her for this. So when Mao Zedong took over, his wife actually wanted to get involved in politics. She wanted to be involved in helping to reconstruct the country. But the problem is that a lot of people were still thinking about Wu Zetian and not Wu Zetian, excuse me. They were thinking about Empress Dowager Cixi and what she had done to China while she was in charge. And so they were kind of looking at Mao Zedong's wife, and they were saying, like, we don't really want another Cixi. Also, too, I think that if you watch The Legend of Korra, I might be mistaken, but I believe that the Empress that they eventually killed, the Empress of the Earth Kingdom, I think that she was based on Empress Cixi, because some of the jewelry that she wore was reminiscent of some photos that I saw of the woman. But anyway, though, so they didn't want another Cixi, and so Mao Zedong's wife had to come up with a way to kind of get the people to come around and imagine like a female ruler as being competent and functional and useful. And so she looked back through history, and she found a period of prosperity in China where a woman presided. Because you find that, you know, throughout history, there are times when women do run the country. And Empress Zetian, I didn't get the name, Empress Zetian actually was one of such women. Empress Wu Zetian actually ran her own empire. Briefly, she ran the Zhao dynasty. And this was because her husband died and none of her sons could rule, because theoretically she was killing all of her kids. This is what makes Wu Zetian really interesting, is before her sort of political revival through Mao Zedong's wife, she was not only obscure, but she was mostly known for the very negative things written about her, because she rose to power in what was likely a murderous and conniving way. She started off as a concubine, as far as the book that I read about her went, and the emperor actually fell in love with her, and she became the favored concubine. She was the chief concubine. And in fact, the queen was having a little bit of trouble having kids with the emperor, and it wound up being that Wu Zetian had the first son of this emperor. This was the emperor of the Tang dynasty at the time. But the trouble was that the first son of a concubine can't really take over China. It needs to be the first son of the emperor's wife. So what they say that Wu Zetian did is she took a pillow and she just smothered her baby. And then when the guards came in, you know, she was in tears, just like, oh no, oh no, oh, it was the emperor's wife. She killed my baby out of jealousy. She just took a pillow and she smothered them. And the emperor believed that Wu Zetian would not have smothered her own child. So furious with his wife, he had her executed, and then he married officially to Wu Zetian. And then within Wu Zetian's lifetime, the emperor passed away. Some people say that she killed him. Of course, there's no proof that she ever smothered her child or that she killed her husband. It's just that's what her political enemies that's what her political enemies wrote, because they did not like her. If there were any proof that she had done these things, she would have been the one who got executed, and she never would have gotten away with killing her husband. But what reinforces this belief is that afterwards she had sons, but they never really got to rule China until she was good and ready. They would get to a point where they could be in power, and then they would sort of die, or just not be able to rule, or whatever. You know, there's a lot of various suspicious circumstances surrounding Wu Zetian's dynasty. And eventually, when she finally stepped down from power, either through death or just one of her sons finally succeeded her, that was when the Tang dynasty resumed. That was the end of the Zhao dynasty. But as far as her political wheelings and dealings went, she was a competent ruler, and she managed to expand the borders of China, and you know, you can look at it from a very positive perspective. So, this is why Wu Zetian is significant, because she was a competent ruler during a time of prosperity. Nothing phenomenally interesting was going on, so it's not like it's not like the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, where you look at this as like a landmark moment in China. But it demonstrated it's a cultural figure that you can use to say that, you know, all right, women can be in charge. So therefore, Mao Zedong's wife should be allowed to make decisions and get involved in politics. This is where this stemmed from. So a political choice, really. And interesting that Civ 5 chose her, because, like I say, it's sort of it's not wrong. It's just that if you understand the history, it's sort of interesting. I mean, just sort of interesting. As far as how she would behave in the Civ game, I don't really know. From what I read about her, I guess she would be conniving. Civ 5 doesn't have very good AI in general, so I can tell you she hates warfare, like all the Civs, and she will denounce you for no reason, like all the Civs, and so on and so forth. I mean, when I say for no reason, I mean there's some kind of internal logic, but personally I feel like the game's AI is just totally irrational and stupid anyway. More so than even in the past games. It's just frustrating. It's because they're trying to win the game on meta things. Yeah. But anyway, though, so Wu Zetian. And then the third one who I think is the most interesting is actually Theodora. And Theodora, in Civ 4, her husband was actually the one that you got to play as, Justinian. And this makes some logical sense because Justinian was actually born into power. He was pretty much destined by birth to be the ruler of the Byzantines. But Theodora was his wife, and historically speaking, she actually shared equal power to Justinian, or some say that she did anyway. So theoretically, you really could actually play with either person, and both would be historically correct. They were different types of people, really. And what's most fascinating about them is that they were both Christian, but they had differing perspective on which form of Christianity was right. And so what Theodora used to do is she used to constantly undermine her husband as far as religious politics went. So I find that kind of fascinating because, like, you look at Civ 4 and you get to talk only to her husband, and then you look at Civ 5 and you only talk to Theodora, and it's almost kind of like, realistically, you would probably be talking to them both as a team. Like, theoretically, like, you should, when you call the Byzantines in that particular era, you know, for those, you should see Justinian and Theodora sitting together, telling you whatever it is that's going to happen, being like, yes, we can agree on this, or no, we can't agree on that. And otherwise, they just have these spats about religious stuff and so on and so forth. But Theodora is interesting because she actually was not born into power at all. She started out, she was born into a very humble beginning, and she went on to become an actress. And when I say actress, I also mean prostitute. She would sleep with men for money. She did a lot of salacious, acts. She went up and she got naked on stage, presumably. But she was a prostitute. There's, this is not a debated fact. This is a thing that's specifically known because of what happened as a result of this fact. But she bounced around from country to country as an actress. She worked for a group or for a guy. and eventually got married to some governor of some other country, and then came back to Constantinople. And eventually, as she started to get a little bit older, she got tired of that whole thing, and she settled down. She got out of the prostitution bit, quit doing the actress thing, and learned to spin wool. You can't retire. You can't retire on being sexy. So she learned to spin wool, and that's what she spent her time doing. And as she was a wool spinner, that's when she met Justinian. And apparently she could not only spin a yarn, but she could literally, she could spin yarn. She could literally spin yarn, and she could figuratively spin yarn. So she was a fascinating figure because she'd been around the world and she'd seen a lot of things, and she had a lot of interesting stories from her days as an actress and a prostitute. And Justinian was kind of smitten with her. He thought that she was a fascinating woman, and he wanted to get married to her. The only trouble was that there was a law that specifically forbade government officials from getting married to prostitutes and actresses. And so Justinian kind of looked at this, and he repealed the law. And so this is how you know that, yeah, she was a prostitute, because the law said that Justinian could not marry a prostitute, and he repealed the law and then got married to Theodora. Now, Theodora and Justinian both had a fair number of detractors. Every historical character does. And like I say, this one had a funny one that I read about, where this was just on Wikipedia, where they were talking about this guy who wrote about them was like, oh, their heads pop off when they fly around the palace and everything like that. But people complained about her she was like, oh, she's a prostitute, she wants to have sex all the time, and so on and so forth. Probably wasn't very true. It seems like, based on her actions, her political actions that I was able to read about, what she cared most about was religion. And she spent a lot of time just fighting with her husband about religious affairs, so on and so forth. So like I say, the fact that Civ 4 lets you talk to only Justinian and Civ 5 lets you only talk to Theodora, in my mind, that's like saying, if you're playing Civ 4, then you're on his good side, probably for some kind of bizarre religious reason. And if you're playing Civ 5, you're on Theodora's good side, probably for some kind of bizarre religious reason. Theoretically, her husband is still there, you just can't talk to him. I don't know why. He's on the husband couch, he doesn't get to talk to you right now. Theodora is in charge for Civ 5. So that's one that's actually, you could justify it and it makes sense. Justinian did actually outlive Theodora. So, like I say, if you were going to go by like, well, if we had to make some kind of absolute measurement, Justinian makes more logical sense. But Theodora was a co-regent, so like I say, the most sensible thing would just be a husband and wife civ, where you just talk to two civs at once, as opposed to just one guy, one person. So yeah, so those are the three that were a little strange, that I hadn't heard of. I said Dido just super disappointing. I'm frustrated by that. Like, why would you do that? Like, why would you replace Hannibal with just a fictional character just for the sake of, like, oh, we need more female representation? Like, find a woman. There's women in history who would actually be, like, interesting. Maybe, like, and just as obscure as Dido. Because once you're going for, like, fictional characters, like people who arguably didn't exist, you are already getting as obscure as possible. Nobody knows who Dido is. Nobody's heard of that. Just like get some Amazoness or something like that. Somebody in Anatolia during the fighting post Carthage's fall, like, because there were important political female figures in Anatolia after the fall of Carthage. They didn't do anything. I mean, they weren't like influential, but at least they were real. At least people wrote stuff about them. The leader of Pontus married a female leader, I believe, who was had all kinds of poetry and stuff written about her because she was a war general. And they were really impressed with that. They were like, oh wow, the leader of Pontus stomps off to war with his own wife. Like, you don't see that every day. That must be great. That must be good relationship building. There were a lot of Romans who actually kind of idolized that, so there's some poetry about it. Of course, that whole era, because there was so much conflict, I mean, they had the slave uprising at the time. You get a lot of writing about Hannibal, you don't get a lot of writing about everything that happened then. But yeah, there's other obscure political figures that you could use if you don't care about whether or not this person is important to history at all. But yeah, it's almost interesting. I kind of wonder. I haven't read hardly anything about Mao Zedong's wife. All I know is that she was promoting Wu Zetian. So I'm almost kind of curious. Like, had they not used Wu Zetian, what if they'd introduced Mao Zedong's wife? And would that have been a political stink? I suspect it might have been, because Mao Zedong is generally reviewed. You could play as Mao in Civ 4. So it would probably, I mean, I feel like people would be mad if you couldn't play as Mao, but you had to play as his wife. But she was politically influential. This is another thing that's a little bit weird when you get into like trying to do gender representation, and you're just like, yeah, no Justinian, but you do get his wife. It would be kind of more fascinating. You know, yeah, it might be a better way of representing it. There were women who ruled singly. Queen Elizabeth is a really good example of a woman who ruled by herself. Catherine the Great also. Catherine the Great had a lot of boyfriends, though. She was a very she comes across as just a little bit diabolical. Like when I read stories about Catherine the Great, you get a real sense for why she was so popular among men. She seems very clever, very intelligent. Like she has a good sense of humor, but also a little bit ruthless because she's a ruler. But like husband and wife teams were a thing, and there were co-regencies. So if they really wanted more representation, that's something that they could do. Not that it matters too much. It's just sort of weird. Like I say, the Dido one is the only one that's really bad. The Dido one is just dumb. Just dumb. Like I said, it's like Romulus and Remus. Like suppose you couldn't play as Julius Caesar. You just had to play as Romulus and Remus. I mean, it would be the same game. I mean, like gameplay-wise, it would be the same. But for a game that's trying to bill itself on, like, yeah, you play as these historical characters, like, you get to play as Odysseus, or like, Romulus and Remus, or, you know, I don't know, it's a fun, like, Bigfoot, you get to play as Bigfoot, or something like that, and then you're like, yes, you are the proud leader of the empire of the Florida Everglades, Bigfoot. You know, it's just sort of like, well, game, you're not really staying true to your word here, are you? Dido might have been real. She might have been a goddess. She might have just been a founding myth. But there's very little history on her. She's got really no personality. Just a dumb affirmative action kind of. Yeah. But how much time do we have? We have a little bit more time. I have some fun stories though about some of the other females that appear in Civilization 5. The ones that are in Civilization for like a good reason have a lot of really fascinating stories behind them. I mentioned Catherine the Great as being just very clever and sort of diabolical. And one of my favorite stories about her is one where one of her boyfriends, they managed to take over a town, like a city, and it was in just total poverty. And it was because there was really nothing going on in this city. And so one of her boyfriends goes, you know what? I can turn this into like a wealthy city in no time at all. I just need a bunch of money. I just need a bunch of seed money. And I'm going to turn this around and make it beautiful. And so Catherine goes, all right, you know, I'll send you some money. And she found some investors, and it wasn't all Russian money, but she got investors. And so they put a bunch of money into this little town. And so after the time period had elapsed where this boyfriend of hers had promised to get the town running, she goes to check it out, and it was still in poverty. It was still a mess. Nothing had improved. I mean, like, they built some new stuff, and they tried to get some things going, but it was like she talked to him. She goes, what happened? What happened? I gave you all this money. What did you do? And he goes, well, it turns out they have no natural resources, and they're in poverty because the area sucks. You can't hardly farm worth a damn, and nobody comes out to visit. There's nothing to see and nothing to do. I couldn't fix it. I couldn't fix it. I couldn't make it better. This is one of these like just tragedies. Like, this is an age-old tragedy about dealing with poverty, is that you'd really like to believe that if you just put enough time and effort into just, I mean, it's just like, it was just a bad area. He couldn't fix it. And so Catherine was just like, oh my God, I have to show our progress to our investors. Like, what are we gonna do? And so they sat down and they hatched up this plan. And she goes, okay, I got it. We're gonna show him on a river tour exactly what improved. And so what she did is she gets the investors and she goes on this boat. And they're driving down the rivers, and there's all this, just like all the buildings along the river are like freshly painted, and like people are out there with like these like thick flocks of sheep, and you know, everybody's like dressed really nice and they're looking really good. It's just, as you can see on your left, you know, we managed to renovate the buildings, and you know, all of our the esteemed Russian plans for, you know, renovating poor places. Look at this Russian prosperity right here. And the investors were all very impressed, and they had a good time, and they just, you know, said goodbye. All they had done is they'd spruced up all the buildings along the river, and then they got like all the town sheep together, and they just put them like with one shepherd, and we're like, there, you look like you're just filthy rich. So they just made it look like they'd done a really good job, and in the end, they were just like, who dodged the bullet there? Man, the investors would have been pissed if they found out we basically farted all their money away on a dead town. So, yeah, Catherine the Great. Lots of fun stories, fun and interesting stories about the actual women in history who had a real strong impact on the world. But history is interesting, though, because like I say, you never know what of it is real and what of it is sort of exaggerated to make a fun story, because people remember stories so much better than they remember facts. So especially with ancient leaders, like Theodora is depicted in Civ 5 as, like, you meet her and she's like sitting there and she's like, hello. She may not have been like that in real life. That may have just been her detractors writing about, oh, she was a prostitute. She was terrible. But by the time Justinian married her, she had settled down from that life. So maybe she was really good at being seductive. But it's also quite possible that she was just a charming and lovely woman, and that she had done that to survive. And who knows? Same thing, like I say, with Wu Zetian. It's hard to say if she really killed her kids or not. But people, assassinations happened all the time throughout Chinese history. It was a problem, a real problem. In all political dynasties, it's a problem. But you look at China, and there's just like regular upheavals. There's like coups and violence, and just kind of fascinating. Ancient politics is fascinating, but it's all through the perspective of tales. Old stories that may or may not be true. Except for Dido. Dido, who's not real. Dido, who has no fascinating stories because she is not a real person. Yeah. But anyway, though, I suppose that'll be it for today. So thanks for joining me, everybody. You guys have a good day.